Alright, hello everybody. We're gonna go ahead and go in and come ahead on and do our little video for this week. Now, for this week, I do realize that it is also a certain Hispanic holiday, and out of context that I did not cover it last year, I wanted to go ahead and for this video, we were going to go ahead and we're just going to kind of cover what the history is behind the Hispanic holiday of Cinco de Mayo. Now, unfortunately, and I've actually discovered this quite permittently, many people don't know what it is, and that even includes even Hispanic people. There's even people who are of Hispanic descent who do not even truly know what Cinco de Mayo is because they weren't raised in Mexico. They're simply of that descent. And most people here in the United States will celebrate it if they're of Hispanic descent or know somebody that was, but they don't really realize what the holiday's for. It's actually very commonly messed up with Mexican Independence Day, which is not until September 16th, not May 5th. So today we were going to go ahead here and we're going to talk about basically the main historical context here of what Cinco de Mayo is. We're not going to really relate to the holiday, but more what Cinco de Mayo is, and that is it is in remembrance of the Mexican victory over the French Empire at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. So this is what we're going to discuss today is basically this battle or little French occupation of Mexico, as we'll probably really could call it more, but the Battle of Puebla was very important. So that's what we're going to cover here today. So to start out here, we got to look at what Mexico was in the 19th century. Keep in mind that Mexico had gained independence from Spain in 1821, and in the ensuing decades since, it hadn't really been able to become a strong, fully fledged young nation like the United States had just a few decades before. Mexico was constantly in upheaval, it was constantly in political strife, wars, economic troubles, all kinds of stuff. I mean, within 10 years after, immediately after the Mexicans gained independence, they had a small, short lived Mexican empire, and then they decided to abolish the monarchy, and then they moved to a somewhat of a republic. And then you had Santa Anna, who kind of came in there, and he claimed to be a president, but he was more of a dictator. He was more of an absolute dictator in Mexico. He very much shaped Mexico through the 1830s, through the 1840s, 1850s, and Mexico also suffered defeat during that time. Santa Anna was not exactly the best dude because he kept, during his little power in Mexico, during his reign, he very much kept losing territory to other states, especially the United States. Where in 1836 he ticked the Texans off enough that the Texans decided that we are going to break away and no longer be part of you, which I think we're actually going to cover the Texas Revolution here for too long, because it's something I think needs to be touched upon, because most people don't know Texas was for a time its own independent country. Yes, we think of it as a state today, but for a time, Texas was an actual country for about 10 or 9 years. But anyway, in 1836, he ticks the Mexicans off. They flee. They break away. They win their war of independence against Mexico. Then, roughly 10 years later, he chooses to prolong a war with the United States, so that didn't go very well for him, and he loses a huge chunk of Mexican territory up anywhere north of the Rio Grande. And that, of course, don't look good on his eyes. So eventually, in 1855, after numerous of the ensuing decades and years of Santa Anna's rule, and Mexico just gradually growing weaker and weaker and just not really improving, the people finally overthrew Santa Anna in 1855 and decided, okay, we're done with you. So up until the 1850s, Mexico has been in the state of gradual decayment. It's weakening. It's not really becoming stronger. It's becoming weaker. So this is where Mexico is standing by this time. Now, Mexico increasingly was becoming politically divided, kind of like the United States today. You had your conservative right-wing faction, and then you had your liberal left-wing faction. Well, in 1858, this comes to a head when a civil war breaks out in Mexico that lasts roughly about 3 years. The War of Reform, as it is called in Mexico, in which the conservatives and liberals literally go at it. they decide that one government is better than the other, and they both are trying to claim that they are the legitimate government of all of Mexico. This results in a 3-year-long civil war between the two opposing sides, in which the was kind of started by the liberals, who were already mainly in power, and the liberals were trying to draft a new constitution for Mexico, in which the power of the Catholic Church was both lessened and its influence was diminished. This, of course, didn't very sit well with the conservatives, who were very much for the old style ways. They didn't like that the Catholic Church was not going to play a big part in government anymore. They didn't like that idea. So we're going to start a war because we don't agree and we don't see any other option. Well, the conservatives, they have some credibility as they are backed up by the Pope in Rome. And then they are also have their capital in the main Mexican capital of Mexico City. Now, the liberals, they don't have the backing of the Pope in Rome, and they are led by a man named Benito Juarez. Now, Benito is the main leader of the liberals. He was supposed to be the president of Mexico, but unfortunately, the Civil War broke out and that was disputed. So, Juarez is leading the liberals, and although they don't really control the inner parts of the country, the liberals maintain control over Mexico's ports. They control access to the ocean and to trade. That strengthens their army and their superiority to the conservatives, who are very much landlocked. They can't get out of the country. And they establish a provincial capital at Veracruz. Now, in January of 1861, the War of Reform comes to an end in Mexico, and the liberals end up being the winners. The conservatives were almost to the point by now that they wanted a monarchy to be restored, which, of course, the liberals were not very much for it, because they remembered that Santa Anna had been very much a dictator, even though he hadn't been an official monarchist, and we really don't want to go back to that. But anyway, the liberals end up winning, which, of course, the conservatives, I mean, they've lost, but the tensions are not done. The conservatives are very much, it's kind of like the Confederates after the end of the American Civil War, which ironically is starting about this time in January of 1861. The Confederate States are seceding away at this point, just north of Mexico. But it's very much similar to what the former Confederates would do after the Civil War, where many of them, although they had lost the war, tensions were not okay. The tensions were still there between North and South. The South was very much opposed to Reconstruction, to the integration of African Americans into white society, and they did very much, although the war was over, still had their differences. But this is very much the case in Mexico after the end of this Civil War. Now, Juarez is elected president soon after the end of the war. He becomes Mexico's 26th president, and he actually, to this day, revered as one of Mexico's best presidents. He's actually probably the only major Mexican political figure that actually has his own recognized holiday on his birthday. Is an actual patriotic holiday in Mexico, which I believe is in March. Now, Juarez also had a working relationship with President Abraham Lincoln to the north, which was going to help him later on in securing aid from the United States, which he had already basically done. Part of the reason that his liberals had won the war was that he had convinced the United States. He understood that in order for Mexico to survive, it had to have a working relationship with the United States, since the United States, whether they wanted to admit it or not, was much stronger than they were, and they were their northern neighbor. So he realized this, and he very much tried to work with the United States, saying, I am the legitimate government of Mexico, please recognize me, which eventually Lincoln did. Lincoln went ahead and recognized Juarez not too long after he was elected president. Now, by this time, after the end of the War of Reform, Mexico was very much in massive debt. And when I say debt, I mean foreign debt. It owes money to other nations, particularly England, France, and Spain in Europe. They owe tens of millions of dollars to these countries in foreign loans that they have taken out. Unfortunately, Mexico's not really in a very good position at the end of the war to really start repaying those loans because their economy is not exactly in the best condition and they're not making a whole lot of moolah. So Mexico has borrowed more than it can chew. So where's that going to get us? Well, the Mexican government tries to raise some money through incentives such as new taxes that were placed on the commoners, which of course that didn't work out very well. And they tried to sell expropriated church property. Since the liberals had won the war, they had originally advocated that the Catholic Church need be restricted in Mexico. So they started appropriating certain church properties and trying to sell them, make some profit, and then pay off the European loans. Well, it wasn't enough money. They still couldn't make the loan payments on time or the amount that they needed to pay. So basically, simply put, Mexico is broke in 1861. It has no money almost. It's pretty much a broke country with tens of $1 millions in debt. So, in response, President Juarez decides that he is going to suspend all foreign debt payments coming out of from Mexico to the European nations for a period of 2 years. So, Mexico will not repay any of the loans until 1863. Well, of course, this does not sit over well with the European nations such as Britain, France, and Spain, who have these tens of millions of dollars they've loaned Mexico, and now their client is basically saying, oh, I can't pay that money right now. Let's get back to that in 2 years. That ain't the way this works. That's not the way the bank works. You try to do that with the bank, they're not going to say, oh, okay, come back in 2 years, we can start paying off the debt. No, they're going to freaking take you to court. Or better yet, they're just going to have the IRS steal the money out of your bank account anyway. But this is the same situation with the European powers. They're not too thrilled with Juarez saying that, oh yeah, we're not making any payments to you for 2 years. This doesn't sit well with them. And aptly, they respond. These three nations, Britain, France, and Spain, invade Mexico's ports, particularly around the port of Veracruz, in late 1861 after Juarez's suspension of repayments to the European countries. They take this chance to invade Mexico knowing that the United States was not going to intervene. Because remember, the United States has the Monroe Doctrine. And that, although they might not be allies with Mexico, they consider Mexico in a a New World power, and that New World powers were to be off limits to further European colonization or interference. So, according to the United States, Britain, France, and Spain have no business in Mexico, and if you ever try to go over there, we're going to kick you out. We're going to act like the big brother, the big protector. Unfortunately, the European powers catch Mexico at a bad time because at this time, as we know, the United States is kind of busy with its own little conflict going on. It's busy with the renegade, rebellious Confederate South, and it's going through the Civil War. The United States really can't focus that much attention on other nations and their problems when it's got its own big problem. So they take advantage of this. The European nations know that the United States is too distracted with the ongoing civil war that is going on in its territory, and thus it's not really going to oppose them if they try to interfere in Mexico right now. So if they take advantage of this, and in late 1861, they invade Mexico. Now, the countries demand that Mexico start immediately repaying them on those loans. Now, thankfully for Juarez, he's able to negotiate enough with Britain and Spain that these two countries decide that, okay, we'll withdraw our troops. They come to an agreement. So he's able to successfully negotiate with Britain and Spain. France, however, another story. France decides, no, no. Oh, and did I even say no, no deal? France decides that we are staying until you start paying. We're not leaving. And they stay there, and they end up even being backed by the conservatives in Mexico. Remember that little defeated faction, because the conservatives think that the liberals shouldn't be in power, and they urge that the French should just take over the country and be under a stable government. Well, French Emperor Napoleon III, who is in power at this time, and yes, he is related to Napoleon, he is his nephew. He is just like his big old uncle and decides, I want a new world empire. I want a French empire. And I already have territory in Africa. I already have territory in Southeast Asia. Let's add some in North America. So Napoleon III decides to not only keep his troops in Mexico, he decides, I don't just want repayment. I'm just going to take over Mexico. I'm just going to conquer it. You can't pay your loans? Fine. Guess what? I'm taking you over. That's what he decides. So instead of continuing the demands for repayment, Napoleon decides, I'm going to invade Mexico and colonize it and make it basically a puppet state. And he knows he's going to do this. He would not have done this if the United States was not going through a civil war, because he would have risked the chance of war with the United States. Well, the United States ain't really going to be able to fight a war right now when it's fighting its own. So this kind of cuts him off on that idea. And he's like, okay, right now is the best opportunity. So by the end of 1861, Napoleon III, we'll call him the third to differentiate him from his uncle, he sends a massive French fleet to the port of Veracruz. And in case you don't know where any of this is, we're going to show the globe here shortly. Actually, we better show where Veracruz is right now. Here is the globe. Remember, I am looking at this from a mirror image, so I do apologize if I point to something wrong here a second. So Veracruz is right here in the Gulf of Mexico. It is right there. I don't know if you can see it. But Veracruz is right there. That's the port that the French invade. They have come from across the ocean from France on over here, and we're just going to invade Mexico because you can't pay your money back. So the French invade Veracruz in late 1861 at the end of the year, around December. The French managed to capture Veracruz, and then in the ensuing chaos, Juarez and his government flee Veracruz and head to Mexico City. This is what sets the stage for the Battle of Puebla, which is going to be what Cinco de Mayo celebrates. The French land a force of this fleet. This fleet is carrying a actual infantry force of about 6,000 men army for the French. And they decide that under orders from Napoleon, they are to march inland to Mexico City, where Juarez and his government have fled, and they are to capture the city to force Mexico's surrender, and basically capture Mexico. Now, the French were superior to the Mexicans. Let's keep in mind, the French are an imperial state at this time. The Mexicans have been struggling to really get it together ever since they've gotten independence. France has colonies in North Africa. It has colonies in Southeast Asia. It is a global power, and it is a modernized power, where the Mexicans are still fighting with little muskets, which I think if any of us has studied guns of old history, muskets, although they were common, they had terrible accuracy. Terrible. The French aren't armed with muskets. They're armed with long-range rifles. Rifles are far more dependable than a musket if you want to hit your target. And they have a much better range. The French, basically, they're superior armed. And they have more experience. The Mexicans, we got little muskets from the 18th century that we're still fighting with, and we can't even get our act together. Now, on the way, the French general in charge of the French army in Mexico, General Charles Latreille de Lorenzes, decided to attack the small town of Puebla de Los Angeles in central Mexico. This was on the way to Mexico City. Now, Juarez got information about this, that Lorenzes was going to head and attack Puebla first, and decided that this is where we will try to stop the French before they can get to the capital. So he rounds up about 2,000 men of his own. Keep in mind, this is only a third of the size of the French army. The French army is 6,000 strong. Juarez is only able to get an army of about 2,000. And then he sends them to Puebla to slow down the French. Now, the Mexicans, keep in mind, poorly supplied and outnumbered by the French. The general in charge of the Mexicans is General Zaragoza, and he has Puebla fortified on the day of May 4th of 1862, a day before the battle. On May 5th, or Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, Lorenzes decides that he will attack Puebla even though the Mexicans have fortified the town. And he's actually very overconfident. Him and the French are extremely overconfident when they attack Puebla. In fact, they don't even use the heavy artillery they have brought with them. The Mexicans are on a hill overlooking the little valley below, and this is what the French have to march up. They have to march up the hill to get to Puebla. The Mexicans are at the top of this hill. The French have brought heavy artillery, which could crush and just utterly decimate the Mexican army before the French even sent anything in from long range. They're so overconfident of their victory over the Mexicans that the French choose not to even use the artillery. Oh, we brought all these big cannons. Just leave them here. We won't need them. This is gonna be a walk in the park. The French instead attempted to intimidate the Mexicans at first with bugle calls and bayonet maneuvers, and unfortunately for the French, these failed. The Mexicans were not deterred. They were not going to be tricked by the French into moving just by a simple little move instead of actually attacking. The French then decide, okay, now we attack. This proves to be their blunder. Keep in mind, they did not use their artillery, and the Mexicans are on top of a hill. Even with a small force, if you're on top of a hill, it's not that hard to defend a hill. You don't need a 50,000 strong army to defend a hill. You only really need a couple hundred men, and it would probably do the job. Because keep in mind, what did the British do at Bunker Hill? They had rows of British grenadiers coming up at Bunker Hill in 1775. The Patriots only had a couple hundred men, I think. I don't think they had that many. But anyway, they endured 3 successive charges of the British up that hill and turned them back twice. And they only retreated not because the British stormed their position, but because they ran out of ammo. But keep in mind, they had a much smaller force than the British did. This is the same situation with the French and the Mexicans. The French start marching up the hill, the Mexicans start firing. It doesn't take long to turn back the French a couple times before the French say, okay, we're not winning this. The Mexicans end up repelling the French 3 times when they charge uphill toward the Mexicans. And then they send the Mexicans decide that we're going to send our cavalry, the horses. And this just breaks the French into a retreat, which almost seemed unlikely because, keep in mind, the French are supposedly better armed, better experienced. They are much more modernized than the Mexicans are, but yet here the Mexicans just basically routed a French army due to poor planning by the French's part. The French end up retreating after they lose a total of around 500 soldiers, while the Mexicans lost fewer than 100 in the Battle of Puebla. The victory ends up inspiring the Mexican resistance to the French invasion, and it actually slows down the French plans to invade Mexico, because now they got a setback. They can't just march on to Mexico City because they just got turned back at Puebla. When Napoleon III learns of the Battle of Puebla, he is enraged that this even occurred, because he's like, how could this happen? How could these men with muskets and poorly trained farmers beat my professional army? And then he learns what did it, the French's incompetence, and he fires his general, dismisses him, and sends another 30,000 troops to Mexico within the following year. This time, Puebla was taken, as the French attacked Puebla again on the second march to Mexico City the following year in 1863, and they actually take Puebla this time. The Mexicans don't defend it. They lose Puebla, and then Mexico City falls shortly after. Juarez flees to the mountains with his troops and continues to claim from there that he is the legitimate government of Mexico under the French occupation, of course. France largely has occupied Mexico at this point. Now, Napoleon III installs an Austrian heir an Austrian archduke, Ferdinand Maximilian von Habsburg, as ruler of Mexico to create Mexico as a Mexican empire of sorts, a second one, because they had one once before when they first became independent, and Napoleon basically installs him as his puppet ruler to rule Mexico and make it a French-friendly state. But in reality, he would answer to Napoleon, which Maximilian takes the bait and goes ahead and assumes the crown of Mexico. So while the French are claiming that now Mexico no longer exists, it is now the French-Mexican Empire under Emperor Maximilian I. The Mexican government, the legitimate Mexican government under Benito Juarez, is up in the mountains still fighting a guerrilla war against the French. And this is largely what occurs for the next few years, until 1865. Napoleon, by this point, he grows especially concerned more with matters at home. He's not really able to divert attention to Mexico anymore because he's starting to become very fearful of his next-door neighbor, Prussia, which, within about 5 years, is about to turn into Germany. Because at this point in the 1860s, Prussia is gaining influence in the German states. It is becoming increasingly dominant. It has just beat the crap out of Austria. It just beat Denmark. It's gaining influence, and France fears a united Germany. It does not want a united Germany because it doesn't want a united state on its border. So they're becoming very fearful of Prussia. Napoleon is starting to focus his attention at home. He no longer is really focusing it in Mexico. Also in 1865, the American Civil War comes to an end. And this begins having an effect as now, without the distraction of its own internal conflict, the U.S. really finally is able to get up, look down south, and say, okay, we're done fighting. What are you doing here? Get out. Well, we don't want to get out. You're going to get out because now I can focus my attention on you. So either get out or go to war. So basically, the big brother wakes up, realizes what's happening, and says, oh, hi, get out. So now the U.S. Civil War is over, and France is starting to have exerted diplomatic pressure on it, placed on it by the United States by the United States, basically saying, get out of Mexico. You have no right to be here. At the same time, the U.S. also starts to supply weapons and supplies to Juarez's government in the mountains. They're starting to supply the guerrilla war, and this starts turning the tide of the war in Mexico as Juarez and his men start beating the French more and more. Napoleon eventually decides that the intervention in Mexico has served its purpose. He will abandon Mexico, and in 1866 he pulls the French army out. However, Maximilian chooses to fight on with his conservative allies in Mexico. The conservatives are very much behind Maximilian, so he decides, no, I want to keep my throne. I got a new empire here. I'm going to keep ruling it. Napoleon's like, sure, man, you go ahead. I mean, they're ticked, and I can see they're going to go to a war with you, and you're probably not going to come out alive without my support. But okay. I mean, see ya. I'm leaving, but yeah, you stay. So Napoleon pulls out. The French pull out of Mexico, and Maximilian is left with his conservative allies, and he decides that he's going to continue to fight on. Very poor choice, my friend. Within a year, in 1867, Maximilian and the conservative generals that he was serving with end up being captured, and they are subsequently executed by firing squad. Yeah, how'd your empire go? It lasted how long? Within a year after the French left, you lost. So in 1867, Maximilian is executed, he's gone, and Mexico is finally restored under its legitimate government, with Benito Juarez restored as the Mexican president. Now, Juarez declared after the Battle of Puebla, it happened almost immediately after, due to the inspiration that it gave the Mexican forces, but Juarez officially declared in 1862 that the date of the Battle of Puebla would be a new holiday in celebration of the Mexican triumph over the French at that battle, which would be the Battle of Puebla Day, or Cinco de Mayo, which has come to be the pronounced name of the holiday due to the date that the battle occurred on, the 5th of May. Cinco, 5, de Mayo, of May. So this is where Cinco de Mayo has come from. It's a celebration of although the Mexicans lost the war, at least initially, the battle is what we celebrate on Cinco de Mayo. The success of the Mexicans at this battle. Not the war, but the battle. The Battle of Puebla is what Cinco de Mayo comes from. However, it is commonly confused with Mexican Independence Day, as we mentioned. Of course, Mexican Independence Day is not May 5th. It is September 16th, in celebration of the first declaration of Mexican independence in September of 1810. However, in Mexico itself, it's actually more of a backwater holiday. It's not really a major holiday in Mexico other than in the Puebla region. It is more commonly celebrated. Cinco de Mayo is more commonly celebrated here in the United States, especially in cities with large Hispanic populations, such as the city of Los Angeles in particular in California. However, it is not so much a celebration here in the United States of the history of it, but it is more turned into a celebration to an opportunity to spread, share, and celebrate Hispanic culture within the United States. Although some do remember what the original holiday is for, in the United States it's more of a Hispanic culture day, is what it is more turned out to be. And celebrations in large cities often occur, with big parades and fiestas and everything else, and of course nowadays people think of margaritas. That didn't exist way back then. But that is where Cinco de Mayo has basically come from. Unfortunately for the Mexicans, the little whole French intervention in the Battle of Puebla really also helped lead to the rise of another dictator within about 10 years, as President Juarez, he dies I think he died or he left office in 1872, one of the two. But anyway, he's gone out of the picture by 1872. He's no longer president. And in 1878, a young cavalry general who had gained recognition during the French Intervention Wars, including at the Battle of Puebla, is Porfirio Diaz. And he becomes this new ruler of Mexico, and he very rapidly becomes another authoritarian ruler like Santa Anna before him. And he remains the dictator, basically, of Mexico from 1878 until 1911, until the Mexican Revolution breaks out. But overall, this was the history behind what Cinco de Mayo is. It's more of the story of the French invasion of Mexico, and although that the Mexicans eventually lost the war and it took the United States to really get them out, the Mexicans did accomplish one significant victory very early on against almost impossible odds, what seemed like they couldn't win at all. And this is what the Mexicans mostly celebrate on Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, in honor of May 5th, 1862, when the Battle of Puebla was fought. So on the map here, you want to know where Puebla is. This is where Puebla is. Right here. I don't know how well you can see it. But it's on the way to Mexico City, which is the big starred city, which you can probably see. But right here, at the tip of my finger is about where Puebla is. It's a little inland. And that is where the battle was fought. Then here we have some portraits. Here we have a portrait of Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico from 1860. Well, actually, we could technically say 1858. 1858 until 1872. One of the best presidents that Mexico ever had, and is still highly revered in Mexico to this day. This was Benito Juarez. Then we have a portrait here of French Emperor Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon, who kind of ordered the French to invade Mexico in the first place. Which, ironically, he lost his throne about 5 years later because he ended up being captured by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. Then the French decide, okay, we're done with the monarchy, we're making another republic. Here is Archduke Maximilian, who became the brief emperor of Mexico during the French occupation of the country, but eventually got captured after the French left and ended up being executed. He was originally from Austria. Then finally, we have a small little drawing portrait here of the Battle of Puebla, which kind of illustrates the French and Mexican armies clashing on that day on May 5th of 1862, where the Mexicans are up here. You see the Mexican cavalry is about to go in. The French are back here. Their reserves are back here. They've tried to march up the hill, and this, of course, is the hill that they've trying to get up to go up into Puebla, and they can't go over it. So that concludes this little video. So for our next video, I'm probably going to go ahead to here and say that we'll do the 6th president video on John Quincy Adams, as I think the next 3 presidents we actually need to kind of hit in tandem, kind of close together, because they're very much relate off each other. So we will have to hit them within a relatively related time frame, so that we're going to probably start on that here soon. There will be some other videos I got planned coming up on different subjects that are not that, so thank goodness for that. But we will get to that when they happen here. So that concludes it for today's little video. So as always, if you got any comments, any questions, or anything like that, be sure to list that in the comment section below. Be sure to like the video if you liked it. Be sure to watch any of the other videos on the channel if you like that. Subscribe to it if you actually can find yourself coming back and forth every once in a while and watching. So as always, just the usual. Any suggestions, and that's also in the comment section. So be sure to do all that as usual if any of that should come to mind. So as always, have a good rest of your week, and we will hopefully see you all back here for the next video, and may God bless you all.